Okay, so today I'm sitting here with Andrew Bailey, now that he's the National Party's Shadow Treasurer. So this morning, Andrew announced the small business rental support package, and I've had a look over the documentation that I've seen come through today, and it's a really exciting piece of work. So Andrew, in your words, can you talk to us about what it is that you've been working on and what you're proposing, please?
Well, thank you very much, Jemma. Hey, I've been very conscious as a former business owner. I've owned, I think, about 14 businesses, and I know the cash flow pressures that business owners go through. And as most people realise, labour is the biggest cost, but the next biggest one is rent. And I've been very conscious that we're now in our third lockdown, and with Delta, I'm concerned that potentially we're going to have even more lockdowns, which would be really devastating for the economy. And I'm worried, the cash flow burn that businesses go through. So the rent is the one area that has been left out of the picture. So I've been working with a whole lot of organisations, and just to test what policy that I was keen to promote. And so the broad strokes of the policy is, look, we believe that for those businesses who are currently getting the wage supplement, which means they must have had a 40% reduction in their revenue, they are already struggling, and they're the ones most at risk of going under. And from a New Zealand perspective, we cannot allow that to happen, particularly if we do another few lockdowns, heaven forbid. And so if you meet the wage subsidy criteria, which means 40% reduction in your rent, then you would qualify for a 50% rent payment from the Crown. And on that, what we've said on that basis is if the Crown's writing out a cheque for 50% of the rent, then there's an expectation that the landlord would agree to a 25% reduction in their rent. This is only applies during level 3 and 4. And if you look at it from the terms of the landlord, what it means that he or she knows that they're going to get 50% from the Crown and 25% from the tenant. So they're guaranteed 75% for a client or customer or tenant who's actually in financial risk. And of course, from the tenant, they know that they're getting 75% basically through the offset. And so we think it's a fair way. We think the real problem is the lack of clarity. And the other bit that we want to have in the proposal that we put forward is that we don't believe mediation actually helps, and that's what the government's been promoting. It's a waste of time. I've been through mediation processes. They're talk fests. What we were talking about is having a souped up arbitration process, which means it's binding decision. So the reason why we haven't mandated the 25% reduction by the landlord is that in many cases, landlords have been incredibly generous. So this will only apply to those where there cannot be an agreement reached between the landlord and the tenant, and either party could go and require arbitration, quick decision. And in the cases where landlords have previously been very generous, it might be totally inappropriate that they agree to the 25% reduction in this case. But there will be many cases where, in fact, landlords have just been difficult, and an arbitrator is going to say, well, my view is that you should agree to this, and I'm making that decision. Done, finished, bang. Because we don't want this dragging on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on, the wage subsidy and the resurgence payments, that can't be really be argued that those are fabulous packages. But I am also in agreement. I'm hearing that, what about business? What about my lease? What about those extra costs? And so that's, the driving force behind what you're working on here is that support for business owners.
Yeah, and the thing is the resurgence payment, which is a new element, people probably don't realise, although business owners will not now, but it is a one-off payment, and it's based on the number of employees. So if you've got 10 employees, that means you'll receive a one-off payment of 5,500. If you've got 20, you'll get 9,500. But if you're running a business with 20 employees, you've got insurance payments, you've got rates, you've got all the other fixed overheads. And I think inevitably that'll get swallowed up in just meeting the other fixed overheads. So the big missing element is the rent. And just to put it in context, Jemma, New Zealand is actually in a very small group of OECD countries that have not put in place a rental agreement. About 70% of all countries in the OECD have put in place some form of rent subsidy. So what I'm proposing is not out of line with what OECD countries are doing. And I think the biggest risk we've got, as I said before, is that if we actually head into more lockdowns, we will inevitably get to a point where banks are probably saying, look, Delta is a different issue from the previous variants. If we've got the likelihood of further lockdowns, as a business, we might take a different view on your risk and therefore maybe less inclined to extend credit. In fact, I was talking to one person today who's exactly that same position. And so they're right now wondering how they're going to pay the rent. They're basically run out of money. The bank are not going to renew their overdraft.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of the ones who will leave will do it in a very, very punitive way with regard to interest rates and terms. Now, I noticed, and one of the things that you mentioned, the ADSL unable to occupy clause. What are the sorts of volumes, and can you talk to us about what that means?
Yeah, just so for viewers, the Auckland District Law Society clause, this is a new clause that got put in place, I think really as a result of the first lockdown, but it predated that. But it's using a technical term, force majeure, which means basically if you're unable to occupy your premises for acts of God, for a better expression, which means, you've got flooding up in Kumu or COVID is a classic example, then if people are lucky enough to have that clause, then that means the tenant doesn't have to pay rent or may have to only pay a certain portion of rent. So for those who've got it, that's great. Unfortunately, I've heard Mr. Robertson talk about and say that potentially he thinks up to 80% of agreements, property agreements now have that clause in them. That is an issue I strongly dispute, and I've been told by, for instance, the franchise operators, Franchise New Zealand just had a meeting today. We think that the likely, and I've spoken to Real Estate Institute as well, we think the likely number or proportion of people who have that favourable clause for their tenants is of the order of about 20%, maybe up to maximum of 40, but I would suspect only 20 to 30%. And the reason why I think that's right is if following the first lockdown, tenants went and tried to put that clause in, landlords, unless there was a renewal of the rent, they were highly unlikely to agree to that, and quite naturally so. Mm-hmm. So you've actually had to wait for people to turn over their new rental agreements and put them in place. Mm-hmm. So that's why I don't think it's anywhere near the number that Mr. Robertson's saying. And if he is relying on that fact, then I think that's probably a reason why the government seems so disinclined to actually want to help business owners, and it shouldn't be the case. We need to see business people survive because we want them to continue to be in operation and continue to employ people, because the worst thing of all the 200,000 odd companies that have applied for the wage subsidy, it's estimated about 780,000 employees are employed in those businesses. Now imagine if we lost quite a few of those. That would be devastating, because they will go on the unemployment benefit.
Yes. So to summarise some of the key points in what you proposed this morning, the tenant would only be eligible to apply for the payment if they'd had a reduction of revenue comparable to the wage subsidy and the resurgence. Yep. The tenant will not be entitled to the support payment in addition to the unable to occupy clause. So that's kind of a catch net for those other ones who didn't have that clause in place. Yep. Entitled to 50%, which you've covered, so long as the landlord agrees to the reduced by a further 25%, leaving 25% to the tenant. Capped in a maximum of 10,000 per month. And
yeah, just to explain that. So the proposal only applies to small businesses. So definition of small businesses, someone who employs 19 employees or fewer full-time equivalents. Now, that accounts for the vast majority of firms. So I think there's a figure of 97% of all New Zealand firms employ less than or fewer than 20 people. So it's focused at the small end of town. And when the 10,000 I talk about is actually the 50% portion. So if you, what it means is a company could be paying a monthly rent of about 20,000, up to 20,000, they would get 50% of it. That's why the 10,000 cap is the 50% cap.
Yeah, super. And the remaining point that you provided was the government will prioritise emergency arbitration services.
Yeah, we need to supercharge this We need to have quick resolution. The worst thing we can have for our businesses is this no man's land where people don't know what's going to happen with the rent. You've got a landlord who's been very strident about requiring rent, and for many cases we're going to see businesses go under unnecessarily, and that's what I'm very conscious about, because I want to see the business fabric of New Zealand continue right through this period of difficulty with COVID. And I think unfortunately we're going to have to learn to live with it.
Yes. And I think you can feel that in the emphasis that you've put in this package. It's clearly coming from, some pretty heavy-hitting conversations that you've had, as well as your own experience in business over your career as well. So now that was put out today, wasn't it? The 1st of September?
Yeah, it was. TV1 ran an interview last night, but basically it's come out this morning. Yeah, formally.
Yeah, so I encourage business owners to have a look at it and see what it is that Andrew's talking about, because it really does, it bridges that gap between the wage subsidy, the resurgence payment, and then the rest of the hurt that those businesses that have suffered at least a 40% reduction are feeling. And it's a very thoughtful piece of work. Andrew, thank you so much for fitting me in today, because I think it's a really important thing that business owners need to know that you're talking about. You obviously understand where they're coming from, and it's important to know that.
Hey, thank you very much, and lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Okay, cheers for that.